The son complained about his stepmother to his father, and before boarding his flight, the father decided to install a hidden camera. When he saw the images, he was horrified by what he saw. Hello, welcome. Enjoy the content, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any stories. Jake was sitting in a small hotel room, the smell of worn carpet mixed with the aroma of weak coffee he had just made. The silence of the room was abruptly broken by his cell phone vibrating on the table, and as he looked at the screen, his heart squeezed. It was Lucas. He hesitated for a brief moment, worry forming into a lump in his throat, before he answered. "Hello?" Jake said, trying to keep his voice steady, despite his anxiety. On the other end of the line, Lucas's voice was laced with sobs. "Dad," began the boy, his voice shaky and full of fear. "Sarah, she screamed again. I'm scared." Jake closed his eyes, feeling his son's pain like a stab wound in his chest. "What happened, my son?" he asked, trying to stay calm. I just drew a picture, and she said it was ugly, that I can't draw." Lucas was crying, and each word sounded like a silent scream echoing in his heart. "Oh, Lucas." Jake took a deep breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to flow. "I'm here. I'm listening to you. I just wanted her to like me." Lucas' voice became a whisper, and Jake felt a wave of helplessness. The boy was being mistreated, and he, as a father, felt that he was failing to protect his son. "I'll sort it out, I promise. You're not alone, Lucas," Jake said, trying to convey a comfort he felt was missing. But what if she gets angrier? The insecurity in Lucas' voice broke Jake's heart. "I'll take care of it, I promise," he reaffirmed, deciding at that moment that he needed to do something, and fast. After hanging up, Jake stood up, his heart heavy and his mind agitated. He began to walk down the hotel corridor, the dull white walls reflecting his anguished uncertainty. As he looked out of the window, the world outside seemed so distant and indifferent to his suffering. He wondered how it had come to this. What more could he do to protect his son? The responsibility of being a father seemed like an immense burden, and the thought of Lucas suffering at the hands of his stepmother consumed him. He knew he had to act, and that he couldn't let the situation drag on. What was at stake was more than just a simple conflict. It was his son's mental and emotional health. With determination growing inside him, Jake decided that he needed proof. He needed to understand the depth of what was going on. The idea of installing a hidden camera popped into his mind, and he didn't hesitate to follow that thought. It was a difficult step, but a necessary one. He left the hotel and headed for an electronics store. The store, with its shelves full of modern gadgets, seemed like a maze of possibilities. Jake walked through the camera section, his mind filled with doubts and fears. As he examined the models, he wondered if he was doing the right thing. What if Sarah finds out? What if it makes things worse for Lucas, he thought. "Can I help you?" asked a sales assistant, interrupting his thoughts. Jake hesitated, but decided to be honest, even partially. "I'm looking for a camera to, monitor the security of my house." He tried to sound casual, but the tension in his voice was palpable. "We have some great options." The salesman started listing the features, but Jake was barely listening. His mind was elsewhere, thinking about Lucas and what was to come. After a few minutes, Jake made his choice. As he paid, he felt the weight of his decision, as if the camera he was carrying was a symbol of his determination to protect his son. He left the store with his mind buzzing with plans, aware that the road ahead would be difficult, but knowing that Lucas's safety was his priority. And in the midst of all the pain, a spark of hope began to shine through, promising that any sacrifice would be worth it if it meant bringing joy back to his son's heart. Jake had come home with a heavy heart. The feeling of guilt followed him like a shadow as he snuck around the house, careful not to make a sound. The late afternoon light filtered through the window, creating an atmosphere that, at first glance, seemed welcoming. But for Jake, that home was full of tension. Sarah was in the garden, busy with the flowers, and this gave him the opportunity he needed. He looked around cautiously, making sure no one was around. His nerves on edge, he took the hidden camera out of his bag. The small box looked harmless, but it represented a monumental decision. He knew he was invading Sarah's privacy, but the need to protect Lucas outweighed any hesitation. The image of his son crying on the other end of the line still echoed in his mind, and he couldn't ignore it. As Jake adjusted the camera in the living room, Sarah's voice echoed from the garden. "Lucas, come and help me with this." She seemed to be doing something simple, but the tone of her voice was authoritative, and it made Jake shudder. He knew that this wasn't the first time his son had been asked to do tasks that weren't appropriate for his age, and this reality made him even more distressed. "Sorry, Lucas," Jake muttered to himself as he positioned the camera so that it captured the living room where Lucas used to play. "I promise he'll make it right." He felt a wave of sadness as he imagined what his son was going through, and the anguish of not being there to protect him weighed heavily on his chest. After making sure the camera was on and working, Jake walked out of the house towards the backyard, where Lucas was playing. The boy was concentrating, stacking wooden blocks into a very tall tower. The scene was both adorable and painful. "He's still so innocent," thought Jake, watching the determination on his son's face. "Hey, champ," Jake called out, trying to hide the concern in his voice. Lucas turned and smiled, a smile that lit up his face, but Jake could see the shadow of insecurity that passed through him. "Hi, Dad," Lucas replied, running towards Jake. "Look, I'm making a tower. Do you like it?" "It's amazing, Lucas. You're a real architect," Jake praised, crouching down to be at his level. He wanted his son to know that he loved him, that he was there for him. "But don't you want to come with me for a walk? We need to get ready for my business trip." Lucas' smile faltered for a moment. "Are you going away again?" The concern in the boy's voice made Jake's heart squeeze. "Just for a few days, but I promise everything will be fine. You have Mom Sarah here, and I'll call you as soon as I get to the hotel," Jake replied, trying to convey a reassurance that he himself didn't feel. "And if you need me, you know you can call me anytime, right?" "Right," Lucas said, the hesitation still evident in his voice. Jake noticed his son's worried expression, and it made him more distressed. He said goodbye with a tight hug, wishing he could stay with him longer, but the reality of the situation demanded that he leave. As Jake drove to the hotel, his mind was in turmoil. He felt torn between the need to protect Lucas and the guilt that he was invading Sarah's privacy. What if I'm wrong, he thought, wondering if the camera was really the solution. Deep down, Jake knew that the only thing that really mattered was his son's well-being. He needed to act, and if that meant crossing a moral line, then so be it. A father's love is capable of anything, even facing the darkness that lurked within his own home. Jake sat on the hotel bed, his gaze fixed on the laptop screen as the hidden camera recordings illuminated his face with a cold, distant light. The tension in the air was palpable, and his heart raced with each new clip that unfolded. He knew he was about to witness the reality he didn't want to see, but the need to protect Lucas forced him to look. The first video started, and Jake immediately recognized the familiar surroundings of the living room. He saw Lucas, small and vulnerable, sitting on the floor with a drawing in his hands. "Look, Mom, I made this for you." Lucas' voice full of hope, echoed in Jake's mind like a distant echo. But Sarah's response was devastating. "What do you want me to do with this? Do you really think this is good? Look at you, Lucas. What kind of artist are you?" The coldness of her words cut like a knife, making Jake's heart sink. He saw Lucas cringe, the expression of happiness turning to despair. The scene unfolded, and Jake felt a wave of helplessness invade his being. He wanted to scream, to run to the screen and protect his son from the cruelty he was witnessing. "This can't be happening," Jake muttered to himself, his eyes fixed on the screen as tears began to stream down his face. He had never imagined that Sarah, the woman he had once loved, could be capable of such evil. The video continued, showing a succession of interactions where Sarah ignored Lucas, belittling him and making him feel insignificant. Each cruel word seemed to resonate more strongly in Jake's mind. Why can't she see how special he is, he wondered, remembering all the moments when Lucas had shone, his talent and creativity often stifled under the pressure of Sarah's disapproval. He remembered how excited Lucas used to get when he talked about his art, and the feeling of frustration grew inside him. The recording finally revealed a scene that left Jake in shock. Sarah, with a look of contempt, said to Lucas, "You're nothing. You'll never be nothing. Why can't you understand that?" The boy, in tears, tried to walk away, but Jake realized that Lucas had nowhere to run. He was trapped in a cycle of emotional abuse, and the pain of knowing that his son was suffering like this was unbearable. Jake closed his eyes, trying to shut out the image of that scene. "I have to do something," he muttered, his voice laced with emotion. The idea of confronting Sarah began to form in his mind, but doubt assailed him. How could he face the woman who had become a stranger, who now treated his son this way? Would it be safe for Lucas? The gravity of the situation pressed down on him like an unbearable weight. The recording came to an end, and Jake found himself in a state of paralysis, his heart heavy. He wondered if he should confront Sarah immediately, or if there was a way to help Lucas without causing even more damage. He remembered the promises made to his son, that he would protect him at all costs. But how could one person deal with the complexity of such a deteriorating family relationship? "I need a plan," he said out loud, as if the words could give him the strength to act. He got out of bed, feeling the urgency pulsing through his veins. Jake knew he had to find a way to rescue Lucas from this situation, but what could he do without destabilizing the boy even more? The question plagued him as he prepared for the next stage of his struggle as a father. "Lucas, I'll help you," Jake promised in a whisper, looking out of the hotel window, the city lights flickering in the distance. He couldn't let his son continue to suffer under Sarah's tyranny. With renewed determination, Jake knew he had to find the courage to act, not just for himself, but above all, for Lucas. Jake sat in a cafe in the light of a rainy afternoon, his mind buzzing with the new responsibility he had taken on. He watched the rain pouring down the window, each drop seeming to tell a story of pain and despair. The decision to investigate Sarah's past was a step he knew he needed to take, even if it meant unearthing truths that might be hard to bear. He couldn't ignore the signs that something was very wrong, and Lucas's protection was his absolute priority. Over the course of the week, Jake made contact with Sarah's longtime friends. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but the need to understand the woman who was now part of his son's life drove him on. The first meeting was in a bar, where he sat down with Marisa, a friend of Sarah's whom he hadn't seen for years. Marisa was a woman with piercing eyes and a soft voice, and she soon realized the anguish Jake was carrying. "Sarah has always had a hard time dealing with her emotions," Marisa began, taking a sip of her drink. "She feels safer when she's in control, but that leads her to be manipulative, It's not the first time we've heard that. Manipulative, Jake repeated, feeling his stomach turn. You mean she mistreats the people she loves? Marissa sighed. It's more complicated than that. She's been through hard things, Jake, traumas that have shaped who she is, but that doesn't justify what she's doing to Lucas. I can't understand how anyone could treat a child like that, Jake said, shaking his head in despair. I just want my son to be safe. You need to know that Sarah has been diagnosed with control disorders, Marissa revealed, looking into Jake's eyes. She fights it, but she doesn't always succeed. And the truth is that change is a long and difficult road. These words hammered away in Jake's head as he drove home. He felt torn, an internal battle between the empathy he was beginning to feel for Sarah and indignation at her actions. He couldn't let this interfere with his mission to protect Lucas. The boy didn't deserve to live under fear and oppression, and Sarah's vulnerability shouldn't take precedence over her son's safety. Over the next few days, Jake continued to investigate, talking to more people who knew Sarah. He heard stories of previous relationships, each revealing a pattern of behavior that made him increasingly worried. One of Sarah's friends told him that she always sought control in her relationships, which often resulted in fights and tumultuous breakups. Jake wondered if he should feel guilty for not noticing this before, but soon remembered that the focus should be on Lucas. That night, Jake lay thinking about everything he had discovered. He imagined what Lucas' life would be like if Sarah didn't change, if this dynamic continued. The idea of his son growing up under the shadow of a stepmother who looked down on him was unbearable. I can't let this happen, he muttered to himself. I have to find a way to help him. With a heavy heart, Jake decided that he needed to talk to Lucas. He wanted to understand how the boy felt, what his insecurities and fears were. That morning, while they were having coffee together, Jake turned to Lucas, who was engrossed in a drawing. Lucas, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? Jake began, trying to adopt a soft tone. What do you mean, Dad? Lucas asked without looking up. I want to know how you feel at home. With Sarah, Jake said, hesitating slightly. You can be honest with me. Lucas hesitated, his blue eyes widening. Sometimes I feel sad. Sarah yells at me and makes me feel like I'm not good enough. Jake felt a tightness in his chest. You're more than good enough, son. No one should make you feel like that. Don't ever forget that. But I don't know what to do, Dad, Lucas replied, his voice shaking. She gets very angry when I try to show her that I've done something good. Jake took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. Lucas, I'm here to help you. We'll find a way to deal with this together. The conversation with Lucas made Jake more determined than ever. He knew he had to act, not only for his son, but also to try to understand Sarah, even if it was painful. What worried him most was the possibility that, in trying to understand Sarah's past, he might end up losing focus on what really mattered, Lucas' safety and well-being. What can I really do? He thought, as he prepared for yet another difficult conversation with the woman who had now become a shadow in his son's life. Jake sat in the therapist's chair, the tension in his muscles visible as he stared out of the window. Sunlight filtered through the leaves of the trees, but the beauty of the moment couldn't dispel the darkness that tormented him. The therapist, a middle-aged man with a warm gaze, watched Jake with an understanding expression. How do you feel about what's happening with Lucas? He asked, breaking the silence. Jake sighed deeply, his hands shaking slightly. I'm worried. He's so small, and I feel like I'm failing as a father. What can I do to help him? It's important that you understand that, as well as protecting Lucas, you can also help him find ways to empower himself, suggested the therapist. Working with him on emotional skills could be a good start. What do you think about dedicating some time to activities that promote emotional expression and empowerment? Jake nodded, his thoughts beginning to churn with the idea. Maybe art games or something? He's always liked drawing. The idea began to take shape in his mind, a way to connect with Lucas, to make the boy feel safe and loved. That's right. Let him express himself. Sometimes children have trouble verbalizing what they feel. Art can be a powerful channel, the therapist replied, with an encouraging smile. Over the next few days, Jake put the therapist's suggestions into practice. He organized an afternoon of painting with Lucas. The room was full of paints, brushes, and white paper, a veritable field of creativity. Jake watched as Lucas dipped his brush into the blue paint, his face concentrated and his eyes shining with excitement. "Look, Dad, I'm making a dragon," Lucas exclaimed, his smile lighting up the room. "It's amazing, my son. You're a talented artist." Jake praised, feeling a little lighter when he saw the joy on the boy's face. During the activity, Jake made a point of asking Lucas how he felt. "And how do you feel when Sarah yells at you, Lucas?" The boy hesitated, his expression changing to a shade of sadness. "I feel small, like I never do anything right." "I understand, my son. No one should feel like that. You're amazing just the way you are. You can always tell me when you feel something is wrong, right?" Jake said, trying to reassure his son. Lucas looked at him, a glimmer of hope in his eyes. "Okay, Dad. I'll try." After the painting session, Jake felt a slight sense of relief. The laughter and meaningful conversations with Lucas brought temporary comfort, but the tension of having to confront Sarah still haunted him. He knew that the moment was approaching and the weight of responsibility was pressing down on him. As he walked through the park with Lucas, he thought about the challenges that still lay ahead. "Lucas, do you feel safe at home?" he asked suddenly, his heart squeezing. "Sometimes yes, but sometimes no," Lucas replied, the sincerity in his voice cutting Jake like a knife. Jake stopped, crouching down to look into his son's eyes. "I promise I'll do what I can to make sure you always feel safe. You're not alone, okay?" "Okay, Dad." Lucas smiled, but there was a shadow of doubt in his gaze, something that Jake felt like a weight on his chest. At the end of the week, Jake sat in his office, reviewing the hidden camera recordings. The pain and confusion were palpable, and he wondered if he was really prepared for what he was about to do. The sight of Lucas in trouble tormented him, and the thought of having to face Sarah made him uneasy. The battle ahead was not only about protecting his son, but also about understanding the complexity of human emotions. Jake took a deep breath, recognizing that he needed to be strong for Lucas. The small glimmer of hope that had begun to shine in his interactions with his son could not be extinguished. He knew that he was approaching a crucial point in his family life, and that courage would be the only weapon he could use to face the darkness that threatened to engulf their home. Jake took a deep breath, his heart racing as he prepared for the confrontation. He knew that facing Sarah would require courage and determination. Tension was in the air, like a storm about to erupt, and he felt like a soldier about to go into battle. He made his way to the living room, where Sarah was sitting, apparently unconcerned, fiddling with her cell phone. Hearing the sound of her name, she looked up, a forced smile forming on her face. "Jake, you're home earlier than I expected," Sarah said, trying to keep her tone light, but the unease in her voice was evident. "We need to talk," Jake replied, the firmness in his voice surprising even himself. He took a moment to gather his thoughts, remembering the recordings that had been tormenting him, about Lucas. Sarah's expression changed rapidly, the smile disappearing. "What about Lucas? He's all right, isn't he?" Jake didn't let himself be shaken. "He's not fine, Sarah. I've seen the tapes. I know how you treat him." She stood up, defensiveness taking over. "Recordings. What do you mean I'm a good stepmother? He's just a disobedient boy. Disobedient? Jake was flooded with a wave of indignation. You shout at him. You make him feel insignificant. That's not being a good stepmother. Sarah crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. You don't understand how hard it is. I have my own problems, Jake. I'm not perfect. Do you think being a stepmother is easy? I'm trying. Jake's anger boiled up inside him. Trying. You're hurting our son. He doesn't deserve this. I have recordings of you, Sarah. I could show them to everyone if I had to. You have to stop this. You can't do this, Sarah screamed, her eyes widening, her mask of control beginning to crack. You can't threaten me like that. Jake took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. It's not a threat. It's a reality. I'm not going to stand by while you hurt Lucas. Has a child, Sarah. He needs love, not yelling. You don't know anything about me, Sarah retorted, her voice shaking, but there was a touch of vulnerability that Jake hadn't expected. You don't know what I've been through, why I'm like this. Jake flinched as he heard this. He remembered the conversations he'd had with friends about Sarah's past, the stories of trauma and difficult relationships. So, if you know you have problems, why don't you get help? It's not too late to change. You don't understand the pressure I feel. Sarah exploded, tears starting to run down her face. I always thought I'd be different, that I'd be a good stepmother. But things haven't turned out the way I planned. The confession left her exposed, and Jake found himself in a dilemma. On the one hand, there was Luke's absolute protection. On the other, a woman who was clearly struggling with her own demons. Sarah, I understand that we all have pasts, but that doesn't give you the right to hurt our son. He's not an extension of your problems. I never wanted to do that, she said, now sounding more vulnerable. I don't know how to deal with it. Sometimes it's all so overwhelming. Jake saw the frustration and fear in her gaze, and for a moment felt a twinge of empathy. He knew that Sarah's past didn't justify it, but the complexity of the situation weighed heavily on him. You need to get help, Sarah, for you and for Lucas. That's what I want. I don't want you out of his life, but that needs to change. The tension continued to hang in the air, but Jake felt that he had broken through a barrier. Sarah seemed less defensive now, more open to the idea that there might be a way out of her pain. Maybe I need help, she murmured, her voice low and hesitant. But what about Lucas? What are you going to do with him? Well, work together. We'll find a way to help him, to make him feel safe again, Jake replied firmly, but with a touch of understanding. I don't want you to disappear from his life, but that can only happen if you change. Sarah nodded slowly, the reality of her actions beginning to set in. I don't know if I can, but he'll try. Jake felt a mixture of hope and caution. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, there was a possibility that things could change. Jake moved away from Sarah and sat down in his office where the light from the lamp illuminated only part of the room. The rest of the space remained in shadow, just like his thoughts. He turned on his computer and began reviewing the recordings he had made. Each clip felt like a blow to his heart, a cruel reminder of the pain Lucas was facing. As he watched, he felt helpless. The anguish reflected in his son's face was an echo of his own childhood, marked by moments of vulnerability and helplessness. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to block out the images that tormented him, but they came back in full force. Why didn't I realize this before? Murmured Jake, his voice almost a whisper. He remembered his own childhood, how he had felt when faced with his father's indifference. If only I had been more attentive. Guilt enveloped him like a thick, suffocating fog. He thought of the times he had distracted himself with work, believing that professional success was what Lucas needed most. But now, the reality was stark and clear. Lucas needed a father to be there for him, someone who would listen and protect him. The memory of moments past assaulted him. He saw himself, a sad boy, seeking approval and love in gestures that were never reciprocated. Compassion began to well up in his heart, and he realized that maybe, just maybe, Sarah was also fighting her own demons. She has her wounds too, Jake thought, struggling to find a balance between protecting his son and understanding human frailties. At the same time, a sense of determination was growing inside him. Jake knew he had to do something, not just for Lucas, but also for himself. He couldn't allow the cycle of pain to continue. "I don't want Lucas to grow up like this," he said aloud, as if talking to the very shadow that accompanied him. He deserves better. That night, as the hours dragged on, Jake made up his mind to talk to Lucas. He wanted to understand how his son felt, what he thought about Sarah, and, above all, how he could help him express his emotions. The next day, when he met him for breakfast, Jake made a point of creating a safe space. "Lucas," he began, "I want you to know that you can talk to me about anything." "How are you feeling about Sarah?" Lucas hesitated, looking down at his plate, his voice breaking. She shouts a lot, Dad. And I just want her to look at me." The words sounded like a whisper, and Jake's heart broke when he heard the sadness in his son's voice. He leaned forward, placing his hand over Lucas. "I understand, son. And you're not alone. I'm here to help you." The boy looked up at his father, his eyes full of tears. "Will you help me not to be afraid?" Jake took a deep breath, feeling the weight of responsibility. "Yes, Lucas." "Well, face this together. You're strong, and I'll be by your side. I want you to know that your feelings are important." Lucas' eyes sparkled, and a small but significant hope appeared in them. "Do you promise?" he asked, the vulnerability in his voice touching Jake's heart. "I promise, my boy. We'll find a way to do this. We'll learn to communicate, to express what we feel. You don't have to carry this weight alone." At that moment, Jake realized that empathy could be the key to breaking the cycle of pain that had infiltrated their lives. Not only was it necessary to protect Lucas, but also to understand Sarah's past failings and wounds. He wanted Lucas to know that, even in the midst of the pain, there was a light. "Let's go together, Lucas. Turn this pain into something better. Are you ready?" "Yes, Dad," Lucas replied, with a small smile that lit up his face. And there, in that illuminated kitchen, Jake felt that, even in the face of darkness, there was a way forward. He was determined to find a cure, not only for Lucas, but also for his family as a whole. And as the day began to brighten, he knew that this journey would require courage and love. After the intense argument between Jake and Sarah, something unexpected began to happen. Sarah, deeply shaken by the confrontation, decided it was time for a change. She no longer wanted to be the source of pain in Lucas' life, and at the same time, she wanted to face her own demons. So she began to seek professional help. One morning, while Jake was preparing coffee in the kitchen, Sarah walked in, looking a little more serene than usual. "Jake, can I talk to you?" The hesitation in her voice was evident. Jake, surprised, just nodded, gesturing for her to sit down at the table. He was skeptical, but at the same time curious about what Sarah had to say. "I've started going to therapy," she confessed, her words coming out hastily. "I'm trying to understand why I behaved like this towards Lucas. I never wanted to hurt him, but I didn't know how to deal with the pain I was carrying." Jake watched her, measuring his words. "It's a good step, Sarah. But you need to understand that this isn't just about you. Lucas is hurt, and you need to make an effort to put it right." Sarah nodded, tears beginning to form in her eyes. I know, and I want to. Yesterday, I apologized to him. I hope he can forgive me. He's hurt, Sarah. Emotional pain doesn't go away easily. You need to be patient and consistent, Jake replied, his voice carrying a firm but understanding tone. Over the next few days, Jake began to notice subtle changes in Sarah's behavior. She began to make an effort to improve her relationship with Lucas. One day, while Jake was in the office working, he heard laughter coming from the backyard. Curious, he peeked out of the window and saw Sarah and Lucas playing together, something that hadn't happened for a long time. Lucas was showing her a new trick with the soccer ball, and Sarah was genuinely interested, smiling and applauding his every attempt. "You're amazing, Lucas. Try again," Sarah exclaimed, the excitement in her voice contagious. Jake felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. He couldn't help but wonder if this change was genuine or just a temporary facade. One sunny afternoon, Sarah approached Lucas with a package in her hands. "Hi, Lucas. Look what I've made for you," she said, her voice soft, and there was a glint of expectation in her eyes. Lucas hesitated, distrust still present in his heart. "What is it?" he asked cautiously. "It's a present. I did a drawing, like the ones you always do." "I wanted to show you that I care," Sarah replied, holding up the package with a nervous smile. Lucas looked at the gift in his hands and, after a moment's hesitation, decided to accept it. He opened the package slowly and found a colorful drawing of a bright sun with flowers around it. I like it," he murmured, his voice low, but a spark of joy began to shine in his eyes. "I'm glad you like it." "I want you to know that I'm here for you," Sarah said, her tone sincere, and Jake could see the determination on her face. Jake watched from afar, his heart torn between hope and caution. He knew that real change would take time and effort, but at the same time, something inside him began to believe that maybe, just maybe, the darkness could give way to a new light. The interaction between Sarah and Lucas was a sign that the road to recovery might be beginning. And perhaps, after so many storms, the family was finally on its way to a healthier, more united future. Jake found himself in a state of anticipation and apprehension, carefully observing the interaction between Sarah and Lucas in the living room. The atmosphere was charged with a mixture of hope and distrust. He couldn't help but notice how Lucas hesitated, his eyes fixed on the floor, as Sarah tried to approach him. "Lucas, I want you to know that I'm trying to be a better person," said Sarah, her voice trembling, as if each word weighed tons. Jake sat in a corner of the room, his heart beating fast. Does she really want to change, he thought, as the scene unfolded before him. He saw Lucas look up, his expression a combination of doubt and curiosity. "Are you serious, Sarah?" The boy's question was direct, and Jake felt a chill in his stomach. The child was being cautious, and that only reinforced the tension in the air. Sarah sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Yes, Lucas. I know I wasn't a good stepmother. I let my own problems affect the way I treated you. I'm sorry." The sincerity in her voice was palpable, but Jake couldn't shake the worry. He remembered the scenes he'd seen on the recordings, the shouting, the coldness, the way Sarah had sneered at the boy's feelings. "It's hard to believe you," Lucas murmured, the distrust evident in his words. "I understand, and I don't expect you to forgive me right away." "But I'm here, willing to do things differently," Sarah replied, her gaze fixed on Lucas, trying to convey the sincerity of her intentions. Jake watched the scene with an ambiguous feeling. Could there really be a change? He wanted to believe, but the memory of Lucas' suffering still resonated in his mind. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" Lucas asked, his voice low but firm. "Why didn't you try to be better before?" The cutting question made Jake squirm. He knew the answer Sarah could give. and he didn't want Lucas to have to hear any more excuses. "Lucas, I was lost. I didn't know how to deal with it all," Sarah tried to justify, but Jake realized that the answer was enough for the boy. "That's not an excuse." "You made me feel like I didn't matter," Lucas exclaimed, his voice now raised, expressing the pain he was holding in. Jake felt a lump in his throat, admiring his son's courage in asserting himself. He wanted to intervene, but he knew that this was a moment that Lucas needed to live through on his own. "I know, and I'm sorry about that. Please give me a chance," Sarah begged, her gaze now imploring. Jake, watching the scene, realized that real change wouldn't just be about words, but actions. He remembered what the therapist had said about the importance of building a safe and healthy environment for Lucas. "I can't promise it will be easy, but I'm willing to try," he said, approaching the conversation. Jake felt it was important to intervene, but also that he had to stand his ground. "If you really want to change, you need to show it to Lucas, not just to me. He needs to feel that he can trust you." Sarah nodded, and Jake realized that there was a subtle understanding between them. "I'll do whatever it takes. Lucas, please let me show you that I can be a better stepmother. I want you to feel safe and loved," she said, the vulnerability in her voice evident. Lucas, still hesitant, looked at Jake for support. "Do you think I should give her a chance, Dad?" The question made Jake's heart soar. He knew the answer wasn't simple. "I think you should follow your heart, son. But remember that you have every right to protect yourself. If at any point you feel that things aren't changing, you can tell me." "We're in this together," Jake replied firmly. The tension in the air seemed to begin to dissipate. Jake watched as Lucas seemed to ponder his father's words. He was about to make a crucial decision, and Jake felt helpless but hopeful at the same time. The possibility of a reconciliation was there, hovering between them, but only time would tell if it was genuine or just a facade. "I'll think about it," Lucas finally said, his voice softer now. Jake smiled slightly, recognizing his son's courage in opening himself up to a new possibility. He knew that the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but at that moment, the light of hope began to shine between the shadows of the past. The sun was beginning to set, tinting the sky orange and pink, as Jake, Sarah, and Lucas gathered in the backyard, a space that had once been the scene of silent tension and discomfort, but now pulsed with new energy. Jake watched his son run around, his laughter echoing like music, while Sarah, with a hesitant smile, tried to keep up. "Look, Mom, I can do it," Lucas exclaimed as he tried to balance on one leg, the other raised in the air. The scene was simple, but for Jake, it was like a miracle. He remembered the nights when Lucas would come home sad and dejected, the shadow of his stepmother hanging over him. Now, something seemed to have changed. "You're doing great, Lucas," Sarah praised, her encouraging tone sounding genuine. Jake watched her with a mixture of skepticism and hope. "You're a true artist of balance. I really am." Lucas laughed, his eyes twinkling, and Jake felt his heart squeeze. He wished this was a real moment, that the change he so wanted to see in Sarah was real. "Let's have a competition," Lucas suggested, with a mischievous grin. "Whoever can stand the longest wins." "I accept the challenge," Sarah replied, laughing, as she positioned herself next to the boy. Jake couldn't help but smile at their interaction, but a part of him still hesitated. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy, and scars from the past were still fresh. Seeing the two of them together, Jake remembered the conversation he'd had with Sarah after the confrontation. He still remembered her pained look, the vulnerability exposed when she admitted her faults. "I just want to be a good stepmother, Jake. I never wanted to hurt Lucas." "I'm trying to change, really," she had said, her voice laced with emotion. "It's hard to believe empty promises, Sarah." "What you've done can't be erased easily," Jake replied, his voice firm but with a hint of understanding. "However, if you're willing to make the effort, he'll give it a chance." Now, as he watched his family interact, Jake wondered if he was making the right choice. Maybe, just maybe, forgiveness and reconciliation are possible, he thought, as he watched Lucas and Sarah. "Jake, come too. You can't be left out," Lucas called out, pulling him into the competition. Jake hesitated, but an involuntary smile formed on his lips. He joined in, trying to find his balance, and was soon laughing along with Lucas and Sarah. The afternoon unfolded, and the light, fun atmosphere seemed to dispel the clouds of tension that had previously hung over them. Jake realized that the emotional bond he had always longed for between them was beginning to form, and this filled him with a comforting warmth. "I'm so glad we're together like this," Jake said, picking Lucas up. "This is what I've always wanted for us." "Me too, Daddy," Lucas replied, his eyes shining with joy. Sarah looked at Jake, a new understanding passing between them. "I promise he'll keep working to be the stepmother you and Lucas deserve," Sarah said, her sincerity shining through in every word. Jake just nodded, feeling that, although the road was long, the journey had begun. As the sun slowly set, painting the sky with warm, vibrant colors, Jake felt that the darkness that had hung over them was dissipating, giving way to light. The family, now united, was ready to face the challenges ahead, no longer as strangers, but as a team. They had a lot to learn from each other, and perhaps the greatest lesson of all was the ability to love and forgive, even after the darkest moments. "Let's have a picnic tomorrow," Lucas suggested, his excitement contagious. "I can help make the sandwiches." "That would be wonderful, Lucas." Sarah smiled, and Jake felt a new sense of relief. It was a small gesture, but for him, it represented a big step towards a brighter future. "I'm going to prepare the best picnic basket you've ever seen," Jake proclaimed, knowing that despite everything, there was reason to celebrate and look forward to new beginnings. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.